Welcome everyone to our next video titled Socialism, Welfare, and Corruption. Now, as we look at how things become demising and changing, I think we again have to look at history. Every time in today's world, so many times, we want to throw money at something and fix it. I believe we have to know where the basis of it is, maybe where we changed or what we did. I believe the demise of this country really started in the 60s when the people in Congress realized that if they gave the general public something, they could buy their votes. And we continue to do that. That began in the 1960s when all of a sudden the budget wasn't big enough, so we were going to take money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and put that whole thing into the general fund so we had more money to spend. Then we came back with Medicare and Medicaid shortly thereafter and began that vicious circle of dependency because I wanted to be in power. I wanted to get reelected. Now, think of how some of Washington works. After 5 years, we become vested in health insurance and retirement benefits. We have an annual salary of $174,000, and that's, you got that cost of living increase, and if you're the Speaker of the House and other ones, it's a bit more. But what really bothers me in here is why do we spend millions of dollars for a $174,000 a year job? If we just look at the campaign, I can't think of what state it was in yesterday in the primary, the incumbent spent $5 million for that House seat. His contender was 120, the contender won. I think one, it should prove that you can get elected without spending lots of money. And two, if you're going to get that kind of money from somebody, it's probably going to be a favor somebody's going to like later. We need to get away from those things. We'll talk about that more in that concluding video. But it bothers me of how we do that. Those people create laws that they are exempt from. If we're going to create a law, everybody needs to be there. I don't care what it is. If it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. And if not, then maybe we need to revise it or don't have it, whatever that case may be. This may be a little hard to read in here, but in 1787, during the Constitutional Congress, one of those segments became in here where there was a debate of, for those that are going to serve in Congress, what should we pay them to do it? Some were very little, others were a lot. And they really got to the point where it was almost vicious and they were ready to call it off and go home. Mr. Franklin stood up and made his speech. And this is just a small excerpt. But what it really says is it says, there are two things that are great. The love of power and the love of money. You can come back and individually they can do great things for us. Together, they can be the most vicious of things. And if you take that money and put it together with someone in a place of honor and give them power, you will attract nothing but scoundrels and thieves. That's what they saw happen in Europe. So his point was, and it also states in there, that it gets us to the point where we get into wars we shouldn't be into, with times of surrenders that are not very respectable because we shouldn't have got into them to start with. I think of the vision of this man in 1787 and how, again, some of those things can hold true today. He believed that, and most of those people believe that if you were someone that was going to serve this country, whether it be in the local city council, whether it be at a state level, whether it be in Congress, you should be there because you want to be there and serve your country. You must have another job to support yourself because this cannot become a position of profit. Okay? That's the direction we've gone. Can we change it? Yeah. Are people going to like it? No. When we got into that 1960s time period again, if you look, that's when we started to really escalate the pay scale of the people in Congress. What was their reasoning? Well, if you don't pay enough money, you're not going to get qualified people here. Okay, today, I'm guessing we can say we have qualified people there. But are they moral? one goes hand in hand, I think, to make it work. As we look at, we haven't heard it for a while, but we talk about redistribution of wealth and things being equal. Is the Founding Fathers believe that any time you tried to come back and get that equal distribution of goods, you're putting power in the government's hand that can deprive anyone of anything they want to. To give you an example of that, as you go back to Hungary, when the communists seized power, they took all these private-owned farms and they gave them to the peasants to run, and it really worked good. And pretty soon the government decided they wanted more power. So they started pulling these back and making them communal farms, and they got uprisings. And, it was one of those things that if you spoke too loudly, all of a sudden you no longer exist. Okay? If we think that can't happen in the world today, it can. Power is an amazing thing. Some of us really don't care. Other ones, they thrive on it. And without a moral background to control that, you can have some problems. Some of the statements that those people made in those early days was, a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take everything you have. I'm going to go back, and many of you probably remember the 60s better than others. I was fairly young, but I do remember it, watching the nightly news every night where you had the riots in the various cities. And there was a gentleman by the name of Eldridge Cleaver who formed the Black Panthers, who was a very, how you want to put it, very outgoing and very vocal and not afraid of violence to try to get the point across. He was an atheist, and he believed that communism was the way to have a country, because everybody would be equal in the blacks of this country would have that opportunity to be equal with the whites. Well, this went on, and there was a time in California, I think it was 1966 or 68, where there was a violent uprising. There was a police officer that was killed, and he was supposedly part of that. He fled the country, and he spent 8 years in Algeria, Cuba, and France. And after a while, he looked at the situation. He approached the federal government and said, I'd really like to come back. Whatever my punishment is, I'll serve it. I'd rather live in bondage in the United States than live free anyplace else in the world. And he turned from being an atheist to a believer in God. And he no longer believed that communism was the way for the black community to become equal. He thought it would keep them on the bottom of the totem pole. Now, think of the transformation this man had when he went someplace that wasn't as free as the United States was. Yes, we have some things that aren't the greatest here, but it's still the greatest place in the world to be. I think we just need to recognize it and try to at least keep it on keel and try to improve it as we move along. But I think this is a great example. If people don't believe in those founding ideas that this country was founded on, maybe you should try to live someplace else. See if you maybe come up with that same idea as Mr. Cleaver did. If you don't, come back and tell us. Maybe we need to make changes then. But you have that right. Nobody's forcing you to stay here. As we look at Samuel Adams, they believed that welfare and the leveling of the playing field was unconstitutional. They believed that we need to help the needy, but not completely. The tax system of this country was set up thus that the private sector helped those in need, not the federal government. He looked at it, and Mr. Franklin stated that compassion is counterproductive when it gives a drunk a means to increase his drunkenness. It breeds debilitating dependency and weakness. It blunts the desire or necessity to work for a living and smothers the instinct to strive or excel. The longer we go on with generations of dependency, as I noted before, it becomes a norm. We have to somehow convince these people, give them incentives that there is a better way. Here they're talking about the fact that, in times of emergency, the family should do that. The churches should do it. The community should do it. If you have to get to the point where the state helps in and do it if it really gets bad, and as a last result, the federal government should come in. Why? Because they felt that if welfare was put into practice, it would not only corrupt the government, but it would corrupt the poor. Dependency breeds dependency. And I'll get into a statement, and I can think of some of the recent talk that we've had on one of the senatorial candidates in South Dakota had on the statement she put in a blog in here. I'll discuss that a little bit later, because it's actually something I've used in this presentation for 3 times now. I'll get into a little bit more in depth of what my feelings are there. And it's right here. The Department of Agriculture thinks is great of how many people are on food stamps when they support. And here's that statement that this young lady was bashed for. It says, "Please do not feed the animals because they may grow dependent and not learn to take care of themselves." Some of the statements that you would have heard out there was that this is really immoral that someone would even make a statement like that, because only the lowest of the low, the poorest of the poor, are on these situations. Let me tell you, folks, you better do your investigation if you think that is the case. Do we need to help those people? Yes. But again, that should be done by the private sector. I can think of several contractors that I visited with in this community over the past couple of years. They talk to some of the people that are working and say, why don't you go up to this job, and why don't you take this job? Because I'm not going to get much more money, and I'm going to lose my government subsidy. They can only get him to work 15 or 20 hours a week, because if I'm working any longer, I'm going to lose my government subsidy. We need to give him a different incentive. That's not a good thing. And again, if we look at this generation after generation, it becomes the norm. We think it should be there. If we look at the larger cities that have very much financial problems, look at the dependency programs they have there. It's not good. If you think welfare is a road to ruin and it's a great thing and it's viable, I ask you to look at Europe and the American Indian. You look at the problems that Europe has had, what they've done. You're looking at France at a 70 or 75% tax rate because I want this and I want the government to do this for me. We have to be independent. Now I can look at that American Indian, and I can think, if we look at history in this country, what a great nation they were at one time and how they've lost that. Over the past couple of years in several of the states, they've came back and helped themselves. They're coming back and building casinos to help support themselves. Whether that's a right thing or not, that's a debatable thing. But there's some things moving in the right direction for them to help themselves. We need to find a way to help them continue to do that, to bring them back to that proud people that they once were. In the same way with no matter what nationality you are, where you live, we need to know that we can support ourselves. We had that time in this country when many people were too proud to ask for any help, because I need to be able to support ourselves, to going the other way of, is there something out here that I can get to help myself as a free handout? Again, this concludes this video of socialism, welfare, and corruption. Please join us for the next one of A Demoralizing America.